Well, welcome back, everybody. Once again, it's your host, Brian. And today we're interviewing author and investigative journalist, Ben Zeisloft. Ben, how are you today?
Doing well. Thanks for having me. Appreciate it.
Yes, thank you for coming on. Thank you for making the time. I know you got a lot of work to do, so I really appreciate it. We'll try to keep this to about an hour. And so let's dive right in. And the first question I'd really like to ask you is what was your journey to abolition?
Absolutely. So let's start with just my journey to Christianity. So I grew up in an evangelical home and raised by faithful parents. And really, I think my faith became my own when I was a freshman in college. And some of those same students who brought me to the Lord took me to the abortion mill for the first time in Philadelphia, where I went to school. And, just seeing moms and dads willfully murder their babies was, it changed me because I had always grown up pro life. I knew that abortion was wrong. I knew that I was for ending it. Didn't know quite what that looked like, but seeing it actually happen in front of me was life changing. So over the next few years, I was aware about abolitionism. I started following groups like Abolitionists Rising. So at the time, they were Free the States and Apologia Studios with Jeff Durbin. So I kind of knew it was out there, and I didn't really think that carefully about it. But a couple of years later, so it would have been summer of 2021, I actually met the Abolitionist Rising guys in Nashville, Tennessee, when they were at the Southern Baptist Convention, and we didn't really talk too much about abolition when we were there, but we just played some card games and stuff. But I went home and I listened to some of their Liberator podcast episodes, and they made an open and shut biblical case for abolishing abortion, not just regulating it, not doing it from a Christian standpoint as well. That's critically important, as with opposing abortion, you have to be Christian first, and then comes the biological and the philosophical and all the rest. But that's sort of how I entered the movement. Is like a nominal faith growing up, I think, but then really getting challenged on the abortion issue, being forced to think through it, but actually seeing it in real life.
That's it's interesting you mentioned the Liberator podcast. That's kind of how I came to abolition as well. I was working as a welder, ran out of podcasts to listen, and that was one that came up on the feed, so might as well listen to it. Um, so pretty sounds like a pretty typical upbringing as far as like the evangelical type faith. And then you said when you were a freshman in Philadelphia was when you went to the mills for the first time. And so can you kind of walk us a little bit? You said it changed you. Can you kind of walk us what was the most impactful thing? What hit you the hardest?
Yeah, I just saw, moms and dads walking on their own 2 feet, their full volition, willfully taking the lives of their babies. And of course, some of them were pretty brazen about it, mocking us or cussing at us and all the rest. So realizing that, I think that the prevalent narrative in Christian evangelical circles is abortion is sort of a last resort. It's an act of desperation. And that's probably true for a lot of people. It's still wrong, obviously, but a lot of people actually rejoice in it. They actually see it as a perfectly legitimate, normalized option, especially in certain communities in the United States. It's just deeply pro-abortion, pro-choice. There's not really a lot of people just don't even have pro-life influences or people who are against abortion in their lives. So it's just become inculcated in certain cultural subsets in America. Saw a lot of that in Philadelphia as well. So it just sort of shattered my perceptions around abortion. And it's like I said, it's not just some kind of last resort for a lot of people. Increasingly, our culture is becoming brazen toward it and seeing it as a legitimate option. An act of self-fulfillment. Shout your abortion has emerged in recent years, and this needs to be opposed. Is because Christians have not been salt and light on this issue, whereas the historical church has been. We've been derelict in this duty as American Christians. We've not cared about it, so we've let the culture rot on the vine to get to this really depraved point.
No, that's a really good point you bring up, I think, about the church not being salt and light. And then we'll talk some more about that as we get more into your book. But I'd also like to ask you, so what got you into the work of journalism, and specifically investigative journalism?
Yes. So also in college, I studied business, but summer of 2020 hit. I was a sophomore, I believe, in college, sophomore junior year, and all the internship opportunities closed down. So the only place I really had an option to work at was a conservative news outlet in DC. And I've always loved to write, so I'd been involved in the campus paper at Penn, and it was a great fit for me. I love the industry, and I wrote for other news outlets as college continued, and that turned into a full time job at the Daily Wire. Worked for a few years at an outlet called The Sentinel, trying to start that up with some other Reformed Christians. And I've written and still continue to write on the side for a variety of conservative news outlets. So that's what got me into that field. And it's I love to write, and the church needs to see some of these truths displayed, especially on the pro-life establishment, on other issues in evangelicalism. We need more reporters to be doing that sort of thing, and being like training themselves and using those talents for God's glory in that way.
When did you, I guess, first discover this love for writing that you have?
I was one of those kids when when I was little, I was writing stories, and my parents even say that they gave me an author sounding name. I don't know why they would do that before I was even born yet, but they sort of were prescient in that way, I guess.
There you go. Self-fulfilling prophecy on that one.
Yeah.
Um, and so what led you to write your book, Forsakers of the Fatherless?
Yeah, so in reporting on the life issue for the past several years, I definitely noticed a trend of as we were just talking about, a lot of pro-life groups not working from a Christian standpoint, and especially while also hearing, people like Jeff Durbin and Russell Hunter and Bradley Pierce hammering on the importance of being Christian first when approaching this issue. I didn't see that from a lot of pro-life groups. So if you look at most conservative news outlets reporting these days on abortion, they're going to take statements from Students for Life or Susan B. Anthony List or National Right to Life, and they're going to be completely centered on man's reason, on political pragmatism, and that's the sort of thing that we have influencing even conservatives, even Christians, on the issue of abortion. So there's just such a dearth of understanding on this issue and the actual problems at hand. So also reported for the past several years on abolition bills, and the consistent trend was that it was pro-life establishment groups that would kill those bills. It wasn't pro-choicers, it wasn't pro-abortion activists. It was most often, especially in red states, pro-life groups that would oppose the abolition of abortion. So basically, this book, in many ways, is the culmination of multiple years of reporting on one-off bases, but noticing a national trend of pro-life groups being forsakers of the fatherless, of us as Christians trusting them with our money, our time, our talent, our treasure to go out and to go to the state capitol and to oppose abortion, to end abortion once and for all. And they're not doing that. They're doing the opposite of that in many cases. So that's why I wrote the book.
Okay. And so during the authoring of this book, what did you discover that you might say is the common thread among the all of the instances of pro-life opposition to these bills?
Absolutely, yeah. There are a few reasons that I mentioned in the book. So one is the criminalization of women elements. So a lot of pro-life groups hesitate to say that any woman should ever be held accountable for murdering her own child. That's been the most common reason that's been brought up. And, I think it's based in many ways in a sense of false compassion, because there are, of course, women who are, forced into abortion under threat of life and limb, or are in difficult life circumstances. There's a sense in which we can and should have compassion on them and seek to meet their needs. But the vast majority of the time, like as I've been seeing outside abortion mills, is women are going through with abortion just because they want to have abortions. They don't want to be moms. They want to stay in college. They want to continue, having sexually promiscuous lifestyles. Those are the sort of reasons that I saw leading people toward abortion. It wasn't so much the desperation and the scared, battered woman that we usually hear about from pro-life groups. But that's definitely one of the reasons why they would oppose these bills, is this sort of misplaced, overemphasized compassion that actually gets in the way of justice. Beyond that, there was, of course, the Roe v. Wade was still in effect for a lot of these bills. Not all of them, but some of them that I mentioned in the book. So I think we can and should still defy unjust court decisions, but at the time, that was sort of the cover for why they would oppose abolition bills. And there's also sort of this perennial excuse of political pragmatism of, we need to win our next election. We have to, if we run this bill, it'll be used against us by the Democrats, and we'll lose seats in the next cycle. And this is happening in deep red states, some of the most red states in the country, like Kentucky and Oklahoma and places like that, is where this excuse would even still come up, which tells you that it's not really the real reason, because none of these states are going to lose their supermajorities anytime soon. So those are some of the main reasons, and a lot of times it's the same kind of old guard lobbyists who sort of thinks they know how to play 5D political chess. Every lawmaker in the state looks to them to see what pro-life bills are going to be run that year. There's sort of Mr. Pro-life or Mrs. Pro-life in that state. Those are often, sadly, the people who are delaying the true and final abolition of abortion.
Interesting. I haven't heard very many people talk about the lobbyist aspect of the whole thing, because I think that's kind of important because those guys are in the ear of all these legislators, and I've kind of going through the same thing here in Minnesota where we were working with a particular legislator and now he's chasing after another group's like milk toast type pro-life bill. So that's interesting. So what would you say perhaps is this kind of a two questions in one, the best way to counter the old guard type lobbyists, and then also the dangers to the church of this political pragmatism? What are the dangers to the church of this kind of faithlessness in politics?
Yeah, I'll start with the second question about pragmatism. There's, of course, a place for strategy and for prudence in politics, but ultimately, as Christians, we run by providence, not by pragmatism. We trust in the Lord to establish our paths. When we walk in obedience, He tends to bless that. And when we act in faith, He tends to respond with blessing. That's not health, wealth, prosperity. That's just basic Proverbs. If you go through the book of Proverbs or just basic wisdom literature in the Bible, blessing tends to follow obedience. And especially when we're trying to love our neighbors as ourselves and obey God by establishing justice. There's so many commands in the prophets in the Old Testament and even the New Testament about establishing justice in the land, loving our neighbors as ourselves, caring for the fatherless child. That's, of course, why I named the book that way, because every baby murdered by abortion is a fatherless child. Whose father abandoned them, more likely than not, to being murdered under cover of law. So the church needs to go back to her first love in that sense and listen to her Lord and how He cares about abortion, how He hates child sacrifice. And if we just look at what God says about these matters and seek to act accordingly, we'll start to see things shift. And, if we actually take courage, I think it's a big theme right now in the evangelical church is the return of courage, the return of men with chests. We can and should start that by opposing the most obvious, idol, demonic idol in the land, which is abortion. And then what was your first question again?
Um, in your opinion, what would be one of the best ways to counter this old guard type lobbyist paradigm, I guess, that we have right now?
Absolutely. I think, well, they're losing credibility already. So in a lot of these states where they're defending the status quo, the pro-life status quo, which has, exceptions you could drive a bus through, keeping abortion legal for women. Abortions are increasing in a lot of these states. It's shocking, but there are actually 250,000 abortions per year in the 14 states which claim they've banned or mostly banned abortion after Roe was overturned, which is horrifying. It's absolutely horrifying, and it's under the leadership of these old guard pro-life groups. So they're already losing credibility. But when Christians stand up and they support equal protection and abolition, it sort of forces the question. It forces everybody to put their cards on the table and actually show, here's what I truly believe and am willing to act on. So when Christians bring forth the very basic and common sense proposition that murdering anyone should be illegal for everyone, and then pro-life groups start to oppose that and have heartburn over it, that actually shows their cards. It shows that this whole time they weren't really that serious about ending abortion. Maybe they wanted to curtail it or make it harder to get, but they weren't serious about actually treating it like murder, which is ultimately what we need to do in order to truly abolish it.
Amen. Did I hear you right when you said 250,000 abortions per year are performed in the states that say they have banned it?
That's exactly right. So I
Oh,
work full time
man.
as the communications director for the Foundation to Abolish Abortion. One of the things we do besides writing a lot of abolition bills is we do a lot of research and analysis to back those bills up. And part of that is we look very closely at the abortion stats in various states. We pull together as much data as we can from the state governments, from the Gumacher Institute, from Society of Family Planning, various studies and research that tries to track abortion numbers. We put it all together to support our bills. But if you look at around 2019, there are about 180,000 in the same 14 states. So think like Texas, Oklahoma, South Carolina. A lot of the states that I covered in the book actually will be included in that say, oh, abortion's been banned, or even some pro-life groups say, oh, they're abortion-free, which is not true. So over these past 5 or 6 years, between 2019 and 2024, we saw those abortion numbers increase from 180,000 to almost 250,000. So that's a massive increase over the time horizon where Roe was overturned. You would expect those numbers to come down after Roe was overturned, but that's not the case because there aren't actually strong pro-life bans or pro-life laws in these states. These laws don't treat abortion as murder. They keep abortion legal for women, so there's no reason why they should actually curtail abortion, especially with the rapid increase in the abortion pill ever since COVID. Um, at this point, 1 in 4 abortions in the United States are done via telehealth abortions. So that's an abortion provider in a shield law state, which is something like a blue state like Illinois or New York or California, doing a Zoom call basically with a woman in Texas or Oklahoma, explaining to her how to get the abortion pill, mailing it to her. She takes it at home legally because the law actually protects her conduct in doing so, and that's why we have so much more abortion. And these are just the abortions we're able to count. There's so many more abortions that are just outside the medical system that we have no idea about. There's surely thousands upon thousands of those. There are activists who are running around, making stockpiles of abortion pills and starting websites to send it around to women. So it's a massive issue, and it's because of our civil magistrates have refused to abolish abortion, and the church has been way too silent on that being our expectation.
That is that's sobering to hear, right?
Absolutely.
Because you were sold this bill of goods that, oh, we're winning, we're winning, we're winning. Life is winning, and the tide is turning, and all the good talking points. All the good soundbite um, type phrases. And so, in your book, you mention the didactic nature of the law. And so we're kind of getting into the law aspect of all this on so what role does the law play in societal and cultural change?
Absolutely. Well, as Scripture says, and as Reformed Christians have noticed for a very long time, even before the Reformers, one of the functions of the law is as a tutor. So it tutors the culture. It shows all of us what is right and wrong. There's other functions of the law, such as showing us a savior, our need for a savior, that we've broken the moral law. And then for the Christian, the moral law also functions as a guide for our conduct. But generally speaking, the law also restrains evil, especially in the civil law. One of the blessings that God talks about in the Bible about good civil law, about public justice, is the fact that it deters wicked conduct in the first place. A great verse for that is Ecclesiastes 8:11. When the sentence against an evil deed is not carried out swiftly, the heart of the children of man is fully set to do evil. So it shows, if you're not actually punishing evil conduct, you're going to encourage more of it because people look at it, people who are, of course, in our natural state, fallen, sinful, we hate our enemies by nature. They look at that and they say, I can get away with murder. I can get away with doing bad things because nobody's going to come for me. But if we have a state that actually is zealous to enforce the law in proportional ways, of course, with due process, all the rest, then that murder is deterred. So when that public witness, when that threat of violence for those who are going to persist in evil conduct is not there, you just encourage more evil conduct. And that's where we're currently living today.
No, I think that's very, you're seeing that. You mentioned Ecclesiastes 8:11. And when the law is not enforced, that it does encourage more violence. And then I think we're seeing the natural outpouring today of the last 5 decades of this view of this of the law where you can excuse a particular section of the populace from murder.
Right.
And now that has led to this view of human life that is now even bleeding over into the opposition of political parties, where you've got this one side who truly believes that the other side has no value. Their lives are worthless.
Absolutely.
And it's like a
Right.
natural outpouring. Go for it.
Yeah, sorry. No, that's a good point. You just made me think of, two very public murders in the past few weeks. So Irena Zariska in Charlotte, North Carolina, and then Charlie Kirk, right? So you have these repeated career criminals where the state is not actually enforcing the law and just letting them out of jail again and again. I think the guy who killed Irena had like 14 prior arrests, violent criminal. His dad was a violent criminal. His brother's also in jail. So we're just encouraging this violence to fester. And then just beyond kind of urban street crime, you have like the leftist terrorist networks that have not been deterred by the states, because you have the past several years, you've had them burning down cities, you had them rioting outside of federal buildings. The law has not been coming for them, and now they're so emboldened that they're starting to threaten political violence and actually carry out political violence against people like Charlie Kirk. So, and sorry to interrupt, but that's a good
No,
connection. It made me think of those points. Yeah.
no, I really appreciate your thoughts on this. And that's the point of the podcast, right? Is to get your thoughts. Um, and so you mentioned the law, and you mentioned Charlie and Irina and the 14 prior arrests, and then this other aspect, which is one that I think Kristen Hawkins really harps on really quite heavily, and it's this victim type mentality that the woman's a victim because she's been preyed upon by an ideology, right? Well, wasn't Tyler Robinson also preyed upon by an ideology? And she calls for justice on his head. And so, can you maybe? I'm not real sure how to pinpoint that. You know what I mean? And so, I know that's a giant blind spot in the entire pro life platform. And I think it's one that needs to be exposed, but it's a very painful and touchy subject. And so, how would one broach that type of blind spot by respectfully pointing this out?
Right, that is a fantastic point. That yeah, Tyler Robinson, who allegedly killed Charlie Kirk, he was believing lies. He was believing, that his partner was a woman when he was actually a man. He was just inculcated in pornography, it seems, and all sorts of very wicked vices that led him to the point of just encouraging sin in his life to the point where he would take the life of an innocent man because he disagreed with him on politics. And with Kristen Hawkins, yeah, of course she's going to call that out. I've seen her do that repeatedly, call for justice for Charlie Kirk. I've also seen her do that with babies who have been born who have been murdered by their mothers. So there's been, of course, various instances in the news of a mother leaves her baby in the dumpster or stuffs her baby in the plastic bag and puts the baby in the closet, and kind of lets the baby suffocate to death. There are examples of that with newborn babies, which is horrible. And folks like Kristen Hawkins will condemn it, will loudly condemn it, but then just wind back the clock a month or 2 months or 6 months, and then when the baby's in the womb, suddenly the mother becomes a second victim. She's guilty of the culture. She's believing the culture of death. She's a victim of the culture of death. And we just do live in a culture of death, and the way to stop it is, as we were just talking about, having laws that correct that culture and make it very, very clear to the populace. You don't get to just kill people made in God's image because you don't want them to be around. That's never acceptable. Our population needs to learn that, and that starts with the law. The law is the most authoritative standard for something like that. It guides our conduct way more than we ever realize. And most people aren't going to break a law that's going to send them to prison for the rest of their life or even put them to death. They're going to actually respond to that, and over time you'll see that culture of life start to return. And now it's up to Christians, of course, to impact the culture as well, to preach the gospel of life. But we can't just leave out the law aspect. From Genesis 9, God gave us the state as a good gift, as a gift of common grace to restrain evil, and we'd be fools not to want that.
No, I think that's a good point. It's a good point. You mentioned a man, and I think this was in Arizona, if I remember correctly. His last name is Lowinger. And
Yes,
it was
Tony
kind
Robbins
of,
from Oklahoma.
yes,
Yeah.
Oklahoma. Thank you. But you mentioned in the book that this was kind of the beginnings of end abortion now. And could you walk us through kind of exactly what about this moment with Tony Lowinger led to the creation of end abortion now?
Yeah, Tony Lowinger is with National Right to Life. I think he's still active. He might have retired at this point, but at least he was at the time active with National Right to Life, Oklahomans for Life in the state of Oklahoma. He's one of those 5D political chess lobbyists I was sort of talking about. In more recent years, he was actually advocating for returning to rape and incest exceptions in Oklahoma law, so that they wouldn't have a ballot measure and codify abortion into their state constitution. So he's actively advocating for returning to more abortion laws because of what he thinks might happen in the near future. Absolutely foolish, just despicable. But yeah, End Abortion Now really started because Jeff Durbin, wanting to hear out this guy's position because he had opposed an abolition bill in Oklahoma, invited him onto Apologia Radio. And you can actually, I'd encourage folks to go and watch this clip because it's incredible. You just see Jeff trying to reason with Tony and trying to really interrogate his position. So they sort of move beyond the idea of the woman being the victim, but then they move on to abortionists. And Jeff's like, you would agree that an abortionist is a murderer, right, and should be punished as a murderer. And then even there, Tony Lounger was like, well, it might be killing. Like he was sort of hemming and hawing on even the question of whether or not an abortionist who murders tens of thousands of babies throughout his career could even be considered a murderer. And there's actually in that clip you see Jeff throw his pen out of his hands and like put his head in his hands just in pure exasperation. And according to them, that's actually when they realized they needed to end abortion now. They need to awaken the church to realize that these lobbyists that we've been trusting for so long to end abortion are so often not doing that. So it's a great backstory that I was thrilled to include in the book.
No, it was good. A lot of the stuff I heard, and I was like, You're kidding me! Like that's how that went down." It's a wonderful book, and I really encourage anybody to pick up the audio version, the hard copy, whatever. But read it. You also mentioned in your book a headline in Texas that says, in part, meet the abolitionists that the most extreme abortion group. Dot dot dot. It continues on. But why is the idea of equal protection under the law so extreme?
Right. Really, it's not. That's according to the leftists and the pro-lifers. And again, it goes back to us allowing this sort of culture of death to fester in our culture to the point where we now view saying that murdering anyone should be illegal for everyone, including babies in the womb. So many people now view that as extreme because there's been such a lack of a moral witness from the church, from the pro-life world on this matter. But I'm thinking of another more recent headline from NPR earlier this year, where it says once fringe anti-abortion group is now advancing these bills. So we're starting to shift the conversation because even the pro-abortion news outlets, the leftist news outlets like NPR, are willing to call us once fringe, realizing that this position is gaining ground and picking up steam. That because the church is now speaking out again, it's no longer viewed as crazy talk to just say that babies in the womb should be protected from willful murder by their own parents.
No, that's good. That's good. And that is funny. I think I was that a result? Was that the headline as a result of the 2024 conference in North Carolina? Was that article?
That might be right. Yeah, that sounds right.
I
Yeah.
remember hearing something about that. It made me laugh. Um, and you mentioned the immunity and the impunity that is authored into pro-life laws. Walk us through the language that they use because I think they're very crafty with their language. So walk us through the language they use and why it's important that the church be able to recognize this abuse of language.
That's right. A lot of these bills, you'll hear in press releases and in marketing materials from pro-life groups that, this bill would end abortion in our state or would curtail this type of abortion. But then if you actually read the bill, if you go onto your state legislature's webpage and pull up the bill number and read it, it has these carve-outs and loopholes. So it's often something like, this is not to be construed to allow for, criminal penalties for the woman on whom an abortion is induced to perform, something like that, some kind of language like that. It's actually, I believe, model legislation from national right to life that's made its way into a lot of these bills. But these bills have carve-outs, and sometimes it's even worse. I'm thinking of in Louisiana, Mike Johnson's 2016 dismemberment ban, where it banned abortion by dismembering babies, but then the very next paragraph, it said this is not to say that abortion by, and then it lists a bunch of abortion methods like vacuum abortions and all the rest. And it says those abortions basically remain legal even though we're banning this other type. And it has the same effect of saying, like, you can murder somebody with a knife but not with an axe. It's like, what is that actually going to do? That just instructs the murderer, okay, go buy a knife instead of an axe. Like, it makes no tangible difference. It saves 0 lives, even though it's marketed in that way. It's sold to the church in that way. So it's a massive issue. And, anybody listening, I just encourage you, like, go read some pro-life bills and then compare them to abolition bills, right? You can very quickly tell which one was written by Christians who are very serious about drawing the principles of justice from God's word, treating babies without partiality like human beings, and it becomes very obvious when you actually do that comparison.
That's good. That's good. I talk to a lot of people in the church, and they're not even aware that there is this clause in there that says abortion pills are illegal, and it's murder to use them, except if mom does it.
Right.
Um,
Exactly. Utterly absurd.
yeah, it really is. And now there's been a conversation surrounding duress. Um, and my question is, in your mind, should duress be written into the law? Or I think you mentioned it in your book that it's something that's already considered in the due process of, are there extenuating circumstances to this crime? So should we include that language in the bill, or should that simply be left up to the state to decide? And then, is duress a biblical and legal defense? And I have a couple follow up, like qualifying questions after that.
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So we're still working through this at Foundation to Abolish Abortion. Some of our bills do have language that says, if a woman is forced under duress to have an abortion, that is an affirmative defense if she's prosecuted, all the rest. We sort of root that in physiology, not so much partiality. So, that wouldn't be the case if it was a 3-year-old. Like, most states would recognize that duress is not a defense to murder. In common law tradition, you'll see folks basically mentioning that it's better to actually lose your own life than to take the life of an innocent party. But there's certainly debate about that, because it's just because the life of the baby is dependent on the life of the mom. So even if we didn't have those clauses in our bills, that's already the legal standard in a lot of these states. That precedent has already been set, where duress is a mitigating factor in prosecutions. But we're still having that conversation, and definitely going to continue having it. I know even as we record this today, we're going to be having a conversation about it later today. So definitely something worth considering.
No, very, very good. It's it's not something, I think that it's something that is kind of, I guess they say, baked in to our system already, and I don't really know what to think
Right.
about it, about including it in the bill or not including it in the bill. And there's many minds out there that are far brighter than mine that can figure that. But I did have a couple questions, and I don't mean these questions as a slight. I really mean these questions just as a thought experiment.
Sure.
But you did just mention something, and I want to make sure that I wrote it down correctly. Is is the view of duress framed in the reality that the life of the baby is dependent upon the life of the mother? Is that kind of the framing?
Yes.
Okay, okay. Then my
Yes.
questions are not relevant then.
Sure.
So we'll just skip over those. But I appreciate you explaining that part of it. I've never heard that before, so I really appreciate that. Thank you.
Absolutely,
Um,
and
Go
I
ahead.
recognize there's a good debate about this, and I'm not even totally sold on I love abolitionists brothers and sisters who have raised biblical points why that may not be legitimate. So they've talked about like Exodus 1 with Shiphrah and Puah. You can make the case that the Hebrew midwives were under duress to murder babies in ancient Egypt, and they stood against that, and God bless them for it. So there's certainly good biblical arguments on that side as well. When I very clearly acknowledge that. And as a movement, I think we can and should work together and assume the best about each other in coming to bills we can all rally around. So I'm certainly committed to that for sure.
Absolutely. And I think that really we all want the same thing, for a just, impartial bill to be in place that protects all life equally, just like God intended. Um,
Right.
and so, still along the same line of our conversation here involving the law, you had mentioned carve outs and loopholes, and you mentioned that nothing in this bill is to be construed to prosecute the mother. Um, I want to kind of dig into the philosophy a little bit more that's behind that kind of thing. Where does this idea come from that a mother shouldn't be charged with the destruction of her child's life? And is there really a singular point from where this comes from?
It's an excellent question. I think part of it is even just talking to older folks who have been on the sidewalks doing sidewalk ministry for multiple decades since Roe was established. The mindset seems to have shifted a lot in our culture toward a more brazen understanding of abortion. So in the early 1970s or the late 1970s, after Roe was established, in just talking to these older folks, they would say that most women going would be crying, they'd be sad. Some would be truly ignorant. They would just kind of believe the whole clump of cells line. Ultrasounds didn't even exist. So there's a plausible case at least to be made that some women were truly ignorant. I don't think you can really make that case anymore today. I think probably always that wasn't truly the case, but I think today, especially with all the knowledge we have about embryology, about life in the womb, there's not really many women who don't think that they're pregnant with a human life that's worth protecting when they go in to have an abortion. Pretty much all of them are aware that they're pregnant, that they're trading the life of their baby for their own convenience, for their own prosperity. So that's one possible reason. I think is sort of this old guard mentality of seeing an entirely different culture than maybe us younger abolitionists are seeing. But another one is just like the toxic empathy, emotional sabotage that has so gripped the church, as folks like Joe Rigney have articulated, where you sort of take this compassionate stand and you let it just consume everything else and untether you from the truth. So in the Christian worldview, mercy and justice are friends. They kiss. So on the cross, that's exactly what happened. Is God was showing His mercy to us as sinners who need redemption, who needed the cross, and yet He was dealing out the justice that we all deserve for our sins. And there was no contradiction in His character in doing so. He was vindicating His own righteousness in doing so. Just like today, there is no contradiction between criminalizing abortion for all parties involved, including women, and helping women who truly have the temptation toward abortion, do have legitimate financial or medical needs that are pressuring them toward that temptation. Christians can and should do both. We should oppose abortion in the law and the culture, but we should also have compassion on women who may be tempted in that avenue. But it seems like one has consumed the other in a lot of thinking in the pro-life world, which is really unfortunate. I think some of the people who believe that are truly Christians, who just really haven't thought about that carefully, and they've sort of believed that narrative, and they need to come out of that. Because again, it's allowing for thousands upon thousands of babies to be murdered under cover of law, even in the pro-life states.
No, that's good. That's good. It kind of leads me to a question that I've been kind of chewing. Um, how can we ensure that in our bills that those things you were just talking about, that both justice and mercy are considered, right? Because Christ tells them that you worry about the letter of the law, but you ignore the weightier matters. And so, how can we ensure that we don't fall into that trap that the Pharisees fell into?
Right, absolutely. Yeah. A good reflection on that is the fact that we are loving our preborn neighbors by proposing these bills, and their mothers too. And not just by letting them off the hook, but actually creating that deterrent. I know, and you might know as well, plenty of women in the abolitionist movement who have had abortions in the past, and they universally say, if this had been illegal for me, I would never have done it. And I know women who have had one, two, three abortions, and that wait, even after they're in Christ, even after they've received that forgiveness, they still have to battle that guilt and shame from having murdered their own babies. And I think as Christians, we should say, let's not have people in this situation in the first place by deterring murder against preborn babies entirely. And it's not only a mercy on their lives, but also a mercy toward the lives of the mothers who go through or are tempted toward murdering them. And it's a form of love. It's a tougher love. It's not just like wrapping somebody in sunshine and rainbows. It's saying, no, don't go through with conduct that is going to harm you and harm others. So that's certainly the case. And I can think of so many examples of abolitionists who are zealous to go to the state legislatures and try to establish justice, but at the same time they're active in the pregnancy help movement. They're networking with other Christians across the country to get help and aid toward moms who are having abortions or thinking of having abortions. I just think of our group chat for Abolish Abortion in Pennsylvania. You're just as likely to see a call for, hey, there's this mom in Allentown or Philadelphia or Pittsburgh who needs some help with her pregnancy or needs some diapers. You're just as likely to see that kind of message as you are, hey, we have a rally at the state capitol. Hey, can you call this lawmaker to come and support this bill? So it's just basic Christianity. It's just doing all of the above, and we don't need to make any kind of contradiction or opposition between those two very legitimate Christian activities.
Excuse me. I tried to drown myself. I think that kind of leads me into something. I think that's the most sinister thing about the pro-life movement is that it robs women of their need, and even abortive fathers, right? It robs them of their need to repent, and it robs them of the entire gospel. Um, and so we as the church have a responsibility, like you're talking about, to take care of orphans and widows. but then also to demand justice for our neighbors. And I think ultimately, I think you did a really good job in your book highlighting this paradigm of how this Christless conservative movement of protecting some lives is so far inferior than the real movement of Christ led governance that protects all lives as being made in the image of God. And I just want to thank you very much for writing this book and taking the time to come on the podcast here and talk about it. And if I could ask you just one final question before we depart, who would you like to see interviewed, and what is next for Ben Zeisloft and his efforts for the kingdom?
Yeah, praise the Lord, brother. It was just a privilege to write the book, and one of my favorite things with my writing over the past several years is not so much giving my own thoughts, but sort of holding a mic to those who are already doing good work. So the men that I interviewed for the book, are those sorts of men who are, just wonderful Christians, zealous Christians, everyday Christians. They're not anything special. They don't have like millions of dollars behind them. They're just local pastors and everyday blue collar, white collar workers. You'll see some of both in the book who just want to see abortion abolished. They just want abortion to stop in their state, and they're willing to actually do that. So I figured that was a good opportunity to feature that work and to make sure people know about it and know how to imitate it. But in terms of who to interview next, I think men like that across the country, I think we need to do a better job as the abolitionist movement of not only talking to, the national talking heads, names that have big podcasts and things like that, but, those are great people, but also the people in individual states who are doing ground level grassroots work to actually overturn abortion. Those are the sort of people I talk to every single day in my job, and those are the people I enjoy the most. Is just seeing like a father of three who has a full-time job but makes time in his life to ensure that he's opposing abortion and trying to encourage legislation to do the same. And so maybe somebody like that it would be a great guest, is somebody who just has some experience in the political world and also in ministry too. Just maybe folks consistent on the sidewalk. I think we need to feature that kind of person to help the American church see, this is something we can all be doing. It doesn't just have to be the professional lobbying class like we've been relying on for so long, but all of us as the church can rise up and we can, use our talents that God has given us to actually and steward them well and love our poor neighbors as ourselves. In terms of what's next for me, I'm loving my work at the Foundation to Abolish Abortion. We've got a big year next year, legislation in multiple states, including multiple new states. We have a busy few weeks with Bradley Pierce and Jeff Durbin debating Doug Wilson and Toby Sumter in Moscow, Idaho. So Lord willing, I'll be there for that. We have lots of exciting events coming up, and can't wait to share some of those projects with everybody else soon.
Well, that's awesome, and I look forward to hearing about these new states. It's always interesting when that next session kicks off, because
Absolutely,
the
yeah.
sparks start flying, brother, and it's just amazing. But thank you so much for coming on the podcast and making the time to come in. And again, thank you for the book. May God bless you, and may He bless your generations, for 1,000 generations, for your faithfulness, brother. I sincerely mean that. And for everybody watching, thank you for tuning in. And remember, walk humbly